share with us what is on his heart, and I hope that you'll enjoy. Barbara will introduce the guest speaker.
Thank you, President. Our guest speaker is Samuel Kazibwe, Doctor. And you're in trouble. Let me first warn you. He has English. Samuel is an award-winning broadcast journalist, academic, and researcher. He holds a PhD in cultural and media studies from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. He also holds a master's degree in human rights from Makerere University, Kampala, and a bachelor's degree in mass communication from Uganda Christian University. As a journalist in the last 15 years, Kazibwe has worked as a reporter, news anchor, talk show producer, host, and news editor for several media outlets. He is currently the manager of research, innovation, and development at CBS. Besides journalism, Kazibwe is also a senior lecturer at Uganda Christian University, where he also dabbles as the coordinator of graduate studies in the Faculty of Communication, of Journalism, Media and Communication. His research interests fall under mass communication theory, media law, development communication, governance, and human rights. Kazibwe has also attended postgraduate trainings in multimedia production, communication and food security, and diplomacy and cultural studies, all in different locations in this world. So when I said be afraid, I meant be afraid. Today it's in English. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Samuel Kazibwe.
Welcome.
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share my thoughts on the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. The topic I was asked to discuss was that Russia-Ukraine crisis, what is its likely impact on the African continent? The committee that crafted this topic was very careful to avoid using inflammatory language, because as you may be aware, to the Russians, this is not a war, it is a special operation. To the Ukrainians, it is an invasion. So there is no agreement between those two states on what is exactly happening. But there is no doubt that bullets are being fired. Soldiers and civilians are dying in their thousands. That's not a moot point. For starters, I wish to put the war and Ukraine, the country, in perspective before I delve into the nitty-gritties of this crisis. Ukraine became independent in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For the uninitiated, Soviet Union was a socialist state established by the Bolsheviks. When they captured power in 1917, they had an idea of establishing a socialist state, and it materialized around 1922. So that's how they created this country called the Soviet Union. You might call it an empire. It covered a vast territory where you today find countries like Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Transnistria, Hungary, and many other states in Eastern Europe. So, as it collapsed in 1991, independent states emerged, and Ukraine is one of them. In terms of land size, it is the second biggest country in Europe, next to Russia. It is more than 2 times the size of Uganda. More than 2 times, mark the word. More than 2 times. It's about 2.5, the size of Uganda. The population is about 40 million people. There are quite a number of ethnic groups in this country, but the Ukrainians are the majority, making up about 77%. The Russians in this country are about 17%. So the other ethnic groups share the spoils. The Romas, the Crimean Tatars, the Armenians, Moldovans, so many other minority tribes in Ukraine. But the battle for the soul of Ukraine for over 500 years has been between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So Ukraine is surrounded by a number of countries. In the east, you have Russia. They share a border of about 2,000 kilometers. And that is part of the problem we are having today. In the north, you've got a country called Belarus, which has been used to launch area attacks on Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. In the west, you have Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. In the south, you have the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov. You've also got Romania and Moldova. So that's where Ukraine is located. 1991 was not the first attempt by Ukraine or by the Ukrainians to create an independent state. Those who have read history know pretty well that in 1918, there was another major attempt to create a Ukrainian state. In fact, they declared themselves independent from the Soviet Union. They called it the People's Republic of Ukraine. So at the time you had 2 states because the remnants of the Soviet regime in Kiev retreated to Kharkiv and set up their government there. In a couple of months, they were aided by the Soviet government, and they were able to recapture Kiev and restore the authority of Soviet Union. So briefly, that's the history of Ukraine and its relationship with Russia. So some of the issues that have caused the current conflict stem from the mistrust that Russia has had over Ukraine and its allies in the West. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was an unwritten understanding between Soviet Union and the West that the West was not going to let NATO expand deeper into the East. However, as we speak, more than 15 countries in the East, majority of them former Soviet territories, have already joined NATO. So the anger has been building for some time. It didn't start yesterday. The anger has been building for some time. Secondly, the West has not made deliberate attempts to allay the fears of Russia since 1991. For example, it's common knowledge that NATO in part was established to dismantle the Soviet Union. So after its collapse, what's the aim of its continued existence if it is not reformed? Certainly expansion. Certainly expansion. So for Russia, there is a cause for alarm. There is a cause for alarm. In fact, though politicians in the West have not stated this openly, when you read policy papers from policy think tanks that have over time influenced the West, it is quite clear that an attack in whatever format on Russia was not far away. So in the words of Vladimir Putin in his long speech before he carried out the invasion, he described the Russian quagmire as an existential threat, that this is an existential threat. So in this speech, he meant to prepare his population for what was going to happen. He said there are certain steps I'm about to take in a few days' time. But as a result of those steps, sanctions are coming, and they are going to be hard on us. However, even if I were not to take those steps, the sanctions were bound to happen. Because if you follow the discourse in those policy think tanks, the enemy to the West in Europe is Russia, nobody else. So hasten to add that because this is an existential threat, all the other issues can be secondary. And it's a known fact that whenever states are threatened, everything else is secondary. So he warned them that we are bound to suffer, but we seem to have no option. We seem to have no option. For him, Ukraine and Russia are tied at the hip. Because somebody might ask, if the major reason as to why an operation was started in Ukraine is because Putin never wanted Ukraine to join NATO, then why did Russia let other territories join NATO? There are major differences between these siblings. I told you earlier on that these two states share a border of about 2,000 kilometers. They also share the Black Sea, which is very critical in the geopolitics of that region. So, Ukraine to Russia is far different from Moldova, is far different from Hungary, is far different from Armenia. So one of the challenges was that Europe failed to manage Russia after defeating it. It's that defeat that resulted into the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because we know, after the Second World War, Japan and Germany were defeated by the West. But they were able to find a way of managing them. Japan was forced by the United States to reduce its defense budget to less than 1% for 50 years. But US assisted it to become the Japan it is today. The same thing applied to Germany. In fact, for over 60 years, Germany has not been very aggressive in security matters in Europe. Even when it became the richest country in Europe, the situation has just changed with the Ukraine war. It is the first time since the Second World War that Germany is becoming militarily active. So, then the question emerges, why did the West fail to see this? Because even people like Henry Kissinger have eloquently written about this. He warned many years ago what was bound to happen. However, there are certain things we have got to know, that even if the war was to stop today, United States majorly has already benefited in many ways. It has succeeded in cracking the whip on the Russian economy. It is going to take them years to recover. That's a given. Secondly, the American manufacturers of weapons are in big business. Out of the top 6 manufacturers of weapons being used in Ukraine today, 5 come from the United States. In fact, Germany, for many years, which has been less active in military matters, has announced that it is going to buy 35 F-35A military jets from the United States.
For defense.
So, the Americans are making money. Thirdly, they have been able to demonize Russia. Because those that have studied international relations and diplomacy are familiar with the hegemonic stability theory, that since time immemorial, this world has got a policeman. There must be a superpower. Besides the superpower, there are hegemonic contenders. The superpower is the hegemony. Those that struggle to displace it are the hegemonic contenders. So, the aim of the superpower to maintain that position is to make life difficult for the hegemonic contenders. So life now is already hard for Russia. Now, why is demonizing important? In diplomacy, cultural studies is one of the most important elements. It is usually studied using semiotic analysis. Semiosis is the language of signs and symbols. By looking at the way you've walked to this podium, I might be able to write a PhD thesis by reading the signs and symbols. So, culturally, the US, in maintaining its status, must win that cultural war in the West by demonizing Russia. So that every time countries like Germany, France want to do business with the West, the population is against them. How dare you deal with that devil who butchered people in Ukraine? So for them, it is to their advantage. In fact, the Americans were dying to see this war happen. They were dying to see this war happen. Because for them, they have already benefited, even if the ceasefire is announced this evening. The Americans have already benefited. So, there was also another opportunity to avert this crisis. Ukraine and Russia signed the so-called Minsk Agreement in 2015. As a result of the crisis of 2014, when Russia came, took Crimea, and supported separatists in the east, France and Germany led diplomatic talks that resulted into an agreement in Minsk, the capital of Belarus. Of course, in many ways, the agreement was unfair to Ukraine. However, it would have been better to renegotiate an agreement than to raise the ante too high to the level the Ukrainians did, hoping that the Americans would come to their rescue. The Americans have no business joining this war directly, because the benefits, even without joining, are many. This is not Kuwait. This is Ukraine. There is an existential threat for United States, but for Russia, using Putin's word, this was an existential threat. So, despite the bombardment and the power that Russia has exhibited in Ukraine, it faces quite a number of challenges, a number of them. First of all, there is the curse of occupying forces. In modern history, history has been harsh on occupying forces. We can start with the Americans in Vietnam in the 60s and the 70s. In fact, at the start of the war, the leader of North Vietnam warned the Americans that for every American tanker you bring here, you'll be able to kill 10 of my men, but my men will kill 1 of your men. But at the end of the day, we'll win the war. That's what happened. His prediction or wish came to pass when the Americans, after many years, packed their belongings and left Vietnam. Because even if you're powerful, you can't keep your army in foreign lands forever. We have also seen the Americans leaving Afghanistan after 20 years. Can you imagine that they handed over power to the people they helped to overthrow 20 years ago? Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, was the guy overthrown by the Americans. But after 20 years, they handed over power back to the Taliban with the superior weapons. The general is helping me here with more information. That's the fact. So Russia herself has had nasty experiences when it comes to occupying other territories. In 1968, Soviet Union, aided with other countries like Poland, East Germany, went to Czechoslovakia. The objective was to cause regime change in 4 days. At the beginning, it looked to be a success because on day 1, the leader of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, was arrested. But despite the arrest of the leader on the very first day, the war dragged on for 8 months. In fact, the gentleman arrested on day 1 had to be invited to Moscow for talks with the Soviet Union, with the people who captured him. And after the talks, he was returned to power, only to hand over the following year. So Russia is mindful of that experience in 1968. Fast forward 1979, it went to Afghanistan. After 10 years, Soviet Union had lost more than 15,000 soldiers. And after it had left, the people it had installed were overthrown. So that's the dilemma it has if it is to topple the regime in Kiev. The regime can only be sustained if the Russian tanks are in Kiev. The day they will leave, the head of state will also be asked to leave. But even then, Russia has no capacity to pacify the entire Ukraine, especially the western part. So the Americans and their allies also have the capacity to create an insurgency in the West. And it can drag on for 20 years. So even Russia has no easy way out of this. But like I told you from the beginning, they also had no easy option because they had been cornered. They had been cornered, but dragged into a war where there is no easy way out. So, how does this war or this conflict impact Africa? It does so in many ways, because we seem to be headed for another version of the Cold War. Whether this war ends today or it continues, we are headed for another Cold War. Because all those sanctions on Russia are not going to end once. And what does the Cold War mean? It means that the powerful countries are not going to have a common battlefront, but they will take the battlefronts elsewhere, including Africa. So during the Cold War, you had the Soviet Union supporting ANC and their armed group called Umukonto Wesiziwe. Its first army commander was Nelson Mandela. And the West supported the white supremacist government, which we sometimes call apartheid, but pronounced apartheid in the Afrikaans language. So they were fighting on the African soil. You had Africans dying. In Mozambique, it was the same story. In Angola, it was the same story. In Congo, it was the same story. Some leaders then were even assassinated. So, we seem to be headed there, meaning that it complicates life for decision makers on the African continent. As you plan and negotiate a bilateral agreement with China, you've got to be very circumspect on how far you go. Because the distance matters to the other powerful nations. The distance you move in that relationship matters. And all of them are powerful and they have the capacity to antagonize you, like they have always done in the past. So we seem to be headed there. In fact, if you want to understand the gravity of the matter, just look at the recent events in the UN General Assembly. Most countries, not most, quite a number of them, about 35, including Uganda, chose to abstain. They were not sure which side to go. So you can imagine, we're already in that state of confusion. So it means we can even lose, leaders might become overly cautious and even lose opportunities, bilateral opportunities that would help their citizens. But you want to play safe and you say, you see, the Chinese, I don't want your money. Russians, please, no. America, I think that's too much. Because we might also hurt the Russians. So that's where we are headed. And we're already there, starting with that vote in the UN General Assembly. It speaks volumes about how decision makers in the emerging world are troubled. So, the other effect is that Russia has been very active on the African continent in helping African nations to manage insurgencies, especially through its private military company called Wagner. They are present in Libya, they are present in Mali, you'll find them in Mozambique, Burundi, Madagascar, and many other territories. So, how are these missions going to continue, given the challenges they are facing at home? Because as we speak, Russia is also importing fighters from Syria, Chechnya, Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, all those are independent territories. So all those countries have sent fighters to aid Russia. So then what happens to the operations on the African continent? It's a very huge challenge for us. Then certainly the commodity prices that everybody is talking about. Somebody is saying especially soap. Of course, among other products, because we know that many products we use here are imported. Even those that we manufacture here, the ingredients are imported. So once our major trade routes are troubled, we are also troubled. I will be winding up in a moment. Because 3 Panamanian ships have just been hit, allegedly by the Russians, on the Black Sea. So which means now trade on the Black Sea is dead. Yet that sea covers a very big percentage of international trade. The Russia we are talking about is the biggest producer of wheat in the world. It is also one of the leading producers of fertilizers, Uganda and Kenya. We import a lot of fertilizers from Ukraine and Russia. So what happens to the farmer? Already prices have gone up. Even before the direct effect, speculative traders decided to hike. I was speaking to one trader and I was challenging him why they decided to hike prices even before the effect bites, and he said that in their psychology, the moment a businessman gets to know that in the next few months you do not expect to get goods for sale, you hike the price for what you have, because you don't know what is going to happen, yet you've got to pay rent in those coming months. So the buyer has got to foot your future challenges. So that's a huge challenge. Again, you can also talk about the investments in Africa by the Russians and the investments by Africans in Russia. For example, on the African continent, South Africa is the biggest investor in Russia. So what happens there to their businesses when they have been kicked out of SWIFT banking system? When you can no longer use Visa or MasterCard in Russian banks or supermarkets. So what happens to those businesses? So directly, Africa is affected. So in many ways, this conflict is bound to affect us, and it has already started affecting us as Africans. I thank you.
The United States dollar as the global currency for exchange. And I think an element of this confrontation is not just the introduction of a bipolar powers in the world, but also the change in the use of the US dollar. Because what America has been doing is that has been printing money over the last 20 years and then lending it to countries which then buy their treasury bills. I think Russia, much as it is under duress, has realized the real value is not in the dollar. It dumped US dollar treasuries, I think, over the last 5 or so years, and I think many countries that are going to be aligned in that direction have also done, or are also doing. So they were already preparing for this war even before it actually happened. The question now is a country like Uganda. Our foreign reserves are also still in the United States dollars. Are we going to start moving some of them into Chinese yen?
Of course. Thank you, Shem.
Was Dr. Samuel spoken.
Thank you, Joy. Quickly go to...
And thank you, Dr. Sam, for that analysis. I am intrigued because I feel like I want to do that PhD with you. But there is something that I did pay much attention, which is still a question in my head. In your analysis, what are the assumptions of the biolabs, bioweapon laboratories being attacked? How are we supposed to prepare ourselves as Africa or any other country? What do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Miri. Quickly, SP.
Just to remind Dr. Kazibwe, one time he hosted me.
Okay.
At his radio, BBS.
That one.
Yeah, that one. But I'm so impressed with the way you are putting these things together. That you know, it takes really, it takes a long time for one to measure up to what you are talking about. That aside, Russia, you know, when you listen to people who are pro-Russia, they will tell you that, you know, they were trying to chase away, you know, like you said, NATO, who was coming close to them, which is actually very, very true in real sense. Because even if it is, say, on the African continent, if, say, for instance, Somalia, you know, is amassing troops and the Kenyan border and so on, certainly Kenya will get annoyed and, you know, and try to do something to Somalia. So it really, this argument of Soviet Union vis-a-vis what is the country? No, it is who is saying what, you know.
Okay, thank you, SP. SP, I think we have two.
Thank you very much, Sam. My question is to do with perhaps the issue of the financial effect and its ability to actually do as much damage as the narrative of the West has been, largely because it's now seemingly a battle between the liberal world and the communist world. When you look at now China coming together with Russia and literally coming with their own financial system. And I think as recent as yesterday or the last 2 days, Saudi Arabia is considering now dumping the petrodollar and trading directly in the Chinese yuan. So in that sense, is it really going to have an effect on Russia, given that I think China has an economy of its own, being the biggest fear of the US was pushing Russia to China. The second question I wanted to ask was on the African continent. Africa largely is, I don't want to say it's Chinese, but...
You say it.
Yes. It is Chinese, so I don't know how much leverage the Americans will have or the West will have to compete on that front, given the infiltration of China, and I dare say now Russia, because I think most of our ammunition comes from Russia.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Can we have now the...
Mine is about the propaganda that is taking place. Because when you watch CNN and you watch BBC, you find that it's one-sided. They're only giving us news in Ukraine. But now when you watch Al Jazeera, you find that it's balanced. Now when you watch the clips from the Russian state television, you find that they're telling the Russians that there's no war. So please comment on the propaganda that is ongoing.
Okay, quickly, General, and
give you my thumbs up. I wanted you to comment on Russia's, how it has some leverage on Europe in terms of gas, in terms of managing. That's one of them. And how do you see the West managing now? Are they likely to turn off that tap, or they are likely to hold out? Then secondly, the issue of the NATO getting close to, you remember the 1962, the missile crisis, Cuba? That's more or less like, and how did the Americans respond? So now they are blaming Russia, but there was that one. But also on the issue of a bipolar and a unipolar world, how do you see Africa? What should Africa really support? A unipolar world or a bipolar world? Where do we score?
Thank you, General.
Relations and about that voting at the United Nations. When you are seated with a powerful person and sometimes you have to be careful how you vote and how you don't vote. I was told that even abstaining was a problem. Those who abstain.
Why do you abstain?
Why do you abstain? So, and I think there are some follow-ups. What is your opinion about those countries which abstain and the future with those big people? Number two, when the war had just broken up, many people's prediction was that this time it was a confrontation between the US and Russia. But it seems carefully, USA has not directly got into the military confrontation. In your opinion, do you think at some point they will throw something directly, or what will be the impact?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. Lastly, now.
When I was young, I used to Now, what I didn't hear some is how as Africans, how as the continent, we should question ourselves against the impact that is being caused by the crisis. Should we sit there just watch? What advice would you give the Africans, the continent, the Ugandans, the individuals, how to caution themselves against the impact of the crisis?
Thank you. Then we have one from Parity. How can Uganda position itself to benefit from this war? And there are some opportunities we can. Parity, I like the way you are thinking. Another question is from Dr. Kalunji. Says, we have had war in Ethiopia, Sudan, Sudan and a couple of West African countries, but you don't see other African countries speaking against them. When do African countries ever come together in solidarity to speak against wars on the continent? I think Dr. Kalunji is saying that on one time we should have a talk about a war in Africa. Lastly, from Joshua, does this war indicate an era of a new world order? Did USA's poor response to COVID-19 and the long and slow recovery from financial indicate it's a weak world police? Can Africa trust US as a responsible big brother? Those are the questions. I recognize those online. CMP, EDs, CPs, Anthony, PDG, Nelson Kawalia, DGE Mike is online, and the PhD Sam Siona. Good to see you, Sam, online. Please, Doctor.
Attempts have been there, but you ought to know that the journey is never easy. For example, if you're thrown out of SWIFT, China had already started with its cross-border system. It has about 1,000 banks, but over half are based in China. So is Russia going to trade with China alone? Then when you look at the system that Russia runs, started a couple of years ago, it is operational in just 20 countries. SWIFT is operational in over 200 countries. I mean, including territories that are not recognized by the UN. So they had started on this, but it's not an easy journey. In fact, that's why Putin took time to explain this. Besides the propaganda, and I will come to that later, it is a fact that Russia is hurting. And Putin knew and warned his population. So there is no propaganda about that. In regards to the dollar, yes, attempts have always been there. But you ought to know, once again, that despite those attempts, at the time when the war started, for its oil and gas, Russia still traded in the US dollar 80%. Why? There are other challenges, because switching is not like turning from one TV station to another. That's the trouble in the international financial system. And mark you, we are fighting a country which is still a superpower. I started with the hegemonic stability theory to help us appreciate that fact. Before you displace it, it still has certain advantages, like it or not. I'll get to, Joy was just thanking me for the presentation, immediately talking about how can we prepare for the bioweapons attack as Africans. I think there is little we can do. There is little we can do, but we shouldn't also be worried too much. We shouldn't be worried too much. No, we are not going to die. We are not going to die. So Simon Peter just emphasized the existential threat Russia has with NATO. Probably he was trying to justify the so-called special operation in quotes. We had two Jerrys, Jerry 1 and Jerry 2. Jerry 1 wanted me to comment on the suggestion by Saudi Arabia to dump the US dollar. I do not think Saudi Arabia is serious. Saudi Arabia is playing politics. It has had issues with Washington since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. The way the US behaved, Saudi Arabia thinks is not the way the US should have behaved, because they have been partners in crime since the early 1970s. You remember the oil crisis then? So after overcoming it, the US realized that there was a very big problem, that the Arabs can hold it at ransom. So to solve that crisis, they entered an alliance. In that alliance, they've got to protect each other. So if US was to abandon Saudi Arabia, I doubt the monarchy would last for the next 30 years. Because even in the election of the the reigning monarch, it was the first time in the House of Saud to have dissenters. So, which means that they are also cracks. But Saudi Arabia's real intentions are to push United States back to the original fold. That's it. As a partner. Not that its aim is to appease the Russians, because the Russians are not going to help Saudi Arabia in achieving its grand objectives. If you want to understand that in detail, I would invite you to read a book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, because he was instrumental in setting up that marriage. So it can't just you can't just walk out of it like that. There are many consequences for Saudi Arabia. So Jerry too was talking about the propaganda. Yes, it's a fact and it's not new. We know even in the Second World War, the media on either side of the divide was used to satisfy the interests of the leaders on either side. In fact, Adolf Hitler used the media to convince the Germans that he was fighting a just war. Even the public opinion was in his favor. So it is also true as we speak that the owners of the most dominant media houses globally, the owners of the capital, are the biggest beneficiaries of this war because of forward and backward linkages. They are beneficiaries in this war. So they benefit by demonizing Russia. So for a critical observer, it is important to understand the news constructions, the frames, so that for you it is not just garbage in. Watch with a critical mind. And it is important to watch contrary perspectives. Because despite every successful propaganda must have an element of truth. So in every propaganda that you read, that you view, that you consume, there are certain basic facts that are going to be standard. So look out for those and formulate an objective opinion about the conflict. The general was asking about the gas and oil from Russia. Yes, it is not easy for Western Europe to do without that gas. In fact, as Russia was making a resolution to become a little more active in this war, there is one dissenter in parliament who attacked the German chancellor and said that despite this war, for us, we are going to remain on this continent. The Germans and the Russians, whether we like it or not, we are going to remain on this continent together. And it's a fact. They are not going to pack their bags and leave. The Americans are far away. So, in fact, even when they were announcing another wave of sanctions regarding the oil and gas, that by 2030 they want to achieve a total cut from the Russian oil, the Netherlands warned them that it's not very practical. And mark you, the Dutch get about just less than 10%. But they were the first to warn their partners that it might not be achievable. In fact, what shows that it's not easy to achieve that, when the US chose to sanction banks in Russia, the major banks used for oil and gas transactions were not sanctioned. Can you imagine? They were not sanctioned. At the same time, Russia cannot raise its ante so high the way Ukraine did, because Putin is not irrational. Just analyze the way he has engaged in the last 10 years. He's not erratic like the Western media wants to paint him. He knows the rules of engagement. Because just like John McCain put it the late, that Russia is a gas station. Without oil and gas, how is its economy going to survive? So they also know that we must walk circumspectively, despite the sanctions. The moment they leave this route, let us use it. So in response to your question, General, I do not expect taps to be closed completely, because even in the proposal they have for now, they hope to achieve it by 2030. But even then, some colleagues in the European Union have said that that's not achievable. You also talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Certainly it's one of the examples that Russian supporters have advanced in support of their operation. And it's based on the Monroe Doctrine that the United States has followed for many years, that in territories close to it, you cannot introduce weapons that can cause trouble to the United States. So when Kennedy supported exilees from Cuba, supporters of Fulgencio Batista, to go back and try to overthrow the government of the late Fidel Castro in the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuba decided to ally with the Soviet Union, that please come and build your missiles here. And the United States could not stomach it. Kennedy said, if you do not dismantle them, we are headed for a third world war.
So now America wanted to bring it.
So an agreement was reached. United States had to remove its missiles in Italy and Turkey, and Russia also removed its missiles from Cuba. But the United States was also forced to vow never to support a direct attack on Fidel Castro. So if it is true of the United States, why isn't it true of Russia? So that's why we said at the beginning that this is really an existential threat for Russia when NATO gets to Ukraine. The last question from the journal was whether we should have a unipolar or a bipolar. I think the best idea would be a bipolar, but it's not very achievable. The hegemonic stability theory has shown us that since civilization, you have one power, you don't have two.
Cold War was like
It wasn't at all. In fact, even in the Cold War, when you look at the attacks from the east to the west, comparatively, the west was far ahead, was much more superior. So still, you have one hegemony. But the best idea would be to have two, so that there is a system of checks and balances. But history has shown that that's impossible, that you've got to have one state. Saying that you can have two presidents in a country, it can't work. It just cannot work. That would be a failed state. It can't work. So you better fight hard to displace the one you don't want, so that you install yourself. But you can't be a parallel head of state. It's the same practice in the international system. In fact, that's why you see, when Trump introduced very disastrous tariffs on China, the response of the Chinese was not in the same measure. Do you know why? Because it respects certain facts. The response was mild. Because you're not talking about two equals, whether you like it or not. Otherwise, you would have expected China to respond in equal measure. It did not. So that's critical for us to observe. Peter was wondering about the failure to vote on either side. It is true, I agree with you. Even abstaining is a vote, and it's a political decision.
and it has a consequence.
It also has consequences. But the consequences are not as bad as allying with one particular side. So, even in the Cold War, those that found themselves in the middle survived longer than the Nkurumas who crossed the line. They were very powerful. Nkuruma, the Osajefu, very, very powerful. But because he had crossed the line, the end was miserable. The end was miserable. So Nelson was asking, what should Africans do? I think it's better to stay away from this crisis because it's not ours. Ukraine,
Very far.
yeah. Otherwise, we're going to be used as pawns, the way Ukraine is being used as a pawn.
No.
I'm telling you, the Russians, despite the economic losses, have also benefited in many ways. And one of the ways, in the interest of time, is that the West now knows Russia's resolve. It is quite clear. Its resolve is plain. So that's an achievement from this.
Don't go.
The Americans have achieved the many things I've enumerated here. So what is our business in this as Africans? Because that's how we were used in the First World War and in the Second World War. What did we benefit? I think there are better wars we can fight than the war in Ukraine. Mark, what's Russia's interest in Finland and Sweden in regards to this war? The interest is simple. Russia wants Ukraine to adopt the model of Finland, of Sweden, being neutral. As simple as that. Be neutral. That's what it wants. Dr. Karungi, I think his message was to this Rotary group that even African issues should be given an opportunity to be discussed. I will conclude with the gentleman who was wondering whether this is an indication of a new world order. In my view, there is no indication whatsoever. I thank you.
And I'm not saying so because you are here. I would even say so in your absence. But there is an element that you do not talk about. There is somebody talked about commercializing the war by the Americans. I also wonder whether the Russians are not, there are no war merchants. Maybe something that we can discuss with us after fellowship. But with those and other courtesies extended to us, wish to thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And personally, if I had money, I would give you money now, but I'm sorry, I don't have it. But in our culture and our club, we have to give you the certificate in recognition of such a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you, Big Chris.